The supplies for this class are going to be very minimal and simple. These are the colors I'll be using, just 3. This is the Daniel Smith primary set. This is a Winsor & Newton watercolor sketchbook. The paper inside is 100% cotton. It is very small, it's just 5 by 7 inches. And then I have some scrap paper next to me that I can test colors on and test washes. I'll be using a small palette. Of course, you're going to need a cup of water. And then I'm only going to be using these 2 brushes, a large flat brush and then kind of a medium-sized round brush. These are very versatile brushes and we can do a lot with them. Of course, you'll have some paper towels by your side. And that's really it. So now I'm going to show you how to load your palette with your paint. And using paint from a tube is just a little bit different, of course. If you want to use watercolor paints that are in a pan, that is fine. I personally strongly prefer tube paint just because I find that I can get a lot more control over the saturation of my colors when I have that. It's a little bit more difficult to get full saturation with your watercolor paints when you're using pan watercolors, but that's just my experience. You should, of course, just use whatever you happen to have. The tricky thing about tube watercolor paints is that the first time that you open them, if they've gone through any kind of transportation where the pressure has changed, there's a strong likelihood that when you open up that tube for the first time, the paint is just gonna kind of burst out of the tube. So what I have here is just a silicone tool. This is actually something that you can find, I think, in the clay section of most art and craft stores, but I use these silicone tools for a lot of different things, and I actually don't do anything with clay. So they're very useful because they don't have bristles, so you're not going to lose a bunch of paint getting lost inside bristles. And I'm just basically using this to remove all of that excess paint that's sort of bursting out of the tube, and it's inside the lid of the paint as well. I don't like to waste anything, so I'm going to try to use up whatever I can before I even squeeze that tube at all. So I really didn't have to squeeze the tube at all to get any paint out of there. Just a matter of using my tool to kind of dig out all of that paint that was just going to be coming out anyway. So same thing here with this red. Whoops. All right, everything's fine. Saved that tube. And this is just the excess paint that is kind of coming out of the tube right at the onset. I'm not going to squeeze this one at all either because this paint is just coming out. So I'm doing the same thing with my tool. And I'm also going to, here you can see I'm getting some of that excess paint out of the lid because when the pressure changes for these tubes, a lot of that paint is just going to be squeezed into the cap. And I think it's best, of course, just to get that out so you're not losing any paint, not wasting any paint. And also when you try to put the cap back on the tube and it has a lot of paint inside that cap, it's going to make a mess. So you may as well just find a way to get that out. All right, so last but not least, I'm going to then load my yellow paint into this palette. And the amount of paint that I'm loading into my palette right now is quite a lot. And basically that's just because so much of that paint was just bursting out of the tubes anyway. You can kind of see the yellow tube is actually the worst of all 3. So this is actually more paint that I would really need to load into my palette to do a couple of exercises, but I'm going to just get all of that excess paint out and we'll end up using quite a bit of it actually. All right, so let's get to painting.